I grew up thinking every town had a siren night. That's not a joke or an exaggeration. When you're a kid and something has always been part of your life, you just assume the rest of the world has a version of it too. I thought every town had a laminated card on the refrigerator. I thought every family spent one evening a month sitting in the dark, not talking, waiting for a sound they'd heard 100 times before. I thought it was like tornado drills or the bells at church, just something towns did. I was 23 before I mentioned Siren Night to someone outside of Calver and watched their face go completely blank. "Your town does what?" my college roommate had said. And I didn't have a good answer. I still don't. I hadn't been back to Calver in 8 years when my dad died. He went quietly, which is what the hospice nurse told me over the phone, and I appreciated her saying it even though I'm not entirely sure what it means. He'd been sick for a while, and I'd visited twice in the last 2 years, but never for long. Calver pulls at you in ways that are hard to explain when you're there, and even harder to explain when you're not. I always had a reason to leave early. His house was mine now. 3 bedrooms, a detached garage, a backyard that bled into a belt of old oak trees, and a laminated card on the fridge that I noticed the second I walked through the door. It was the same card. I don't know if it was the exact same one from my childhood or if he'd gotten a new one printed at some point, but it was identical. White cardstock, black text, laminated with rounded corners. 9 rules, numbered and clean, held to the fridge by a magnet shaped like an ear of corn that I remembered from when I was 8 years old. I stood there in the kitchen with a cardboard box in my arms and read it the way you read something you haven't thought about in years. Like each word is slightly surprising even though you already know what comes next. The rules were: 1. When the siren sounds, go inside and lock your doors. 2. Turn off all lights inside and outside the home. 3. Do not look out any window until the siren sounds again. 4. If you hear knocking, do not answer. Do not speak. 5. Keep all pets inside. If a pet goes outside during the siren, do not go after it. 6. Do not use any phone or electronic device that produces sound. 7. If someone in your home begins to act strangely, move to an interior room and close the door. 8. The siren will sound a second time when it is safe. Do not leave until you hear it. 9. In the morning, do not discuss what you may have seen or heard during the siren period. I set the box down on the kitchen table and took the card off the fridge. It was lighter than I expected, like I thought years of importance would have given it more weight somehow. I read it again, and then I put it back under the corn magnet and went to get the rest of my things from the car. Petra Holst from across the street came over that first afternoon. She was probably 65, maybe older, with the kind of face that had been pretty once and was now just kind. She brought a casserole dish covered in foil and a bottle of sweet tea, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment before she said she was sorry about my dad. He was a good neighbor, she said, steady. I thanked her and let her in, and she set the food on the counter without being asked. She'd been in this kitchen before, clearly. She knew where things were. We talked for a while about nothing in particular. My dad's last few months, the house, what shape it was in, whether I was planning to sell. I told her I was, but that the estate stuff would take a few weeks to sort out, and I'd be staying until it was done. She nodded like she'd expected that. Then, as she was pulling on her jacket to leave, she said, "The first is in 4 days." I knew what she meant before she'd finished saying it. "I remember," I said. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded square of cardstock. Fresh, crisp edges, not laminated yet. She set it on the kitchen table like she'd been carrying it around, waiting for me to get here. "I figured your dad's old one might be due for a replacement," she said. "Some of the ink was going." "There's one on the fridge," I said. "It looks fine." She glanced at the fridge and then back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not worry exactly, more like the look a teacher gives you when you've gotten an answer right but for the wrong reason. "Good," she said. "Just wanted to make sure you were set." She let herself out, and I stood in the kitchen listening to her footsteps cross the porch and then the street, and then nothing. The next 4 days were busy in the way that sorting through a dead parent's life is always busy. It's not hard work exactly, it's just relentless. Every drawer and closet and shelf is a small decision. Keep, donate, throw away. Some of it I recognized, and some of it was from a version of my dad's life that had happened after I left. And sorting through that felt like reading a book that starts halfway through. The town itself was quiet. It had always been quiet, but there was a specific quality to it that I'd forgotten. Not peaceful exactly, more like held breath. The streets were clean and the houses were kept up and people waved when you drove past them. A gas station and a diner and a dollar store and a hardware store and a volunteer fire department. Calver had about 900 people in it, and they all seemed to know exactly where to stand at any given moment. I went into the hardware store on the 3rd day to buy boxes and tape. The man behind the counter was named Cree, according to his name tag, and he was maybe 70, lean and sun-worn, with a white mustache that he'd had for so long it looked structural. He helped me find the boxes and rang me up without much conversation. I asked if he'd known my dad. "Sure," he said. "Everybody knew everybody here. Good man. Kept to himself, but in the right way." I paid and he bagged the boxes, and then, because I'd been thinking about it since Petra's visit, I said, "You grew up here?" "Born here," he said. "Never went far." "So you remember when the siren started?" The change in him was subtle, but it was there. His hands slowed slightly on the bag. The easy warmth in his face didn't disappear, but something behind it shifted. "The siren's been here longer than I have," he said. He slid the bag across the counter. "You'll want heavy-duty tape for moving boxes. What you've got there is fine for light stuff, but it won't hold on a long drive." I took the bag. "Right," I said. "Thanks." He nodded and looked past me at the door, and I took the hint and left. The 1st of the month landed on a Thursday. I'd done siren nights dozens of times as a kid, but always with my parents there, always with my mum's specific brand of quiet competence running the whole thing. She'd have dinner done by 4, dishes washed and put away. By the time the siren went off at 7 in the evening, she'd have the candles ready, the flashlights checked, the card read aloud once just to review. My dad would sit in his chair, and my mum would sit on the couch, and I'd be between them on the floor with a blanket and whatever book I was reading at the time, and we'd wait it out together. It never felt scary as a kid. It felt like a sleepover, a ritual, something to get through. Being alone in that house on Siren Night was a different thing entirely. I'd been efficient about it. I ate dinner early, cleaned up, turned my phone on silent, and plugged it in to charge in the bedroom. I went through the card one more time, even though I knew all 9 rules by heart. I found my dad's flashlights in the kitchen junk drawer and checked the batteries. Both good. The siren went off at 7 on the dot. It was a long, sustained tone that climbed for about 3 seconds and then leveled out, deep and wide, designed to reach every corner of the town. I'd heard it so many times in my life that my body responded before my brain did. My shoulders dropped, my jaw tightened, and I was on my feet moving to the light switches before I'd consciously decided to. I locked the front door, locked the back, flipped off every light in the house, and stood in the kitchen for a moment while my eyes adjusted to the dark. Outside, through the window I wasn't supposed to look through, I could hear Calver shutting itself down, porch lights clicking off up and down the street, the distant sound of a car door closing fast. Then nothing. The town went quiet so completely and so quickly that it almost sounded like something had swallowed it. I sat in the kitchen with a flashlight off in my hand and waited. For the first hour, it was fine, almost boring the way I'd remembered it. Just darkness and silence and the occasional creak of the house settling. I ate a handful of crackers I'd set out earlier and drank water and sat with my back against the cabinet under the sink, which had been my spot as a kid and which I had found myself defaulting to without thinking. The second hour was different. It started on the roof, a sound, not like weather, not like a branch, something with weight to it, something deliberate, moving from the back edge of the house to the front in a slow, measured path. I sat very still and listened to it cross overhead, and I talked myself through it the way I'd been taught. Deer, raccoon, the wind working on a loose section of shingles. The house was old, and old houses made sounds, especially at night, especially in quiet. The sound stopped above the front of the house. Then, after a long moment, it started back the other way. I sat in the kitchen with the flashlight in my lap, and I did not move, and I did not make a sound, and I thought about the rules. Rule 3 was the one I was closest to breaking. The window above the kitchen sink was right there. Whatever was on the roof would have to come off eventually, and when it did, it would be somewhere outside, and if I looked, I'd know what it was. I didn't look. I pressed my back against the cabinet and I counted my breaths, and I waited for the roof to go quiet. It did, eventually. Around the 2-hour mark, the weight above me stopped moving and didn't start again. The house breathed around me. I ate more crackers. I stared at the dark ceiling and thought about nothing. The second siren came at 10 minutes before midnight. Same tone, same climb, same level note held for about 15 seconds. The sound of Calver exhaling. I waited the full 15 seconds after it faded, same way my mom had always made us, and then I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The street was empty and orange under the old streetlights. Everything looked exactly as it had before. Petra's house across the street had its lights coming on, room by room, in the same steady order. 2 houses down from hers, a man I didn't recognize was standing on his porch in a bathrobe, just standing there, looking at nothing in particular. When he noticed me, he raised a hand in the kind of wave that doesn't mean hello, more like acknowledgement. I raised mine back. It was fine. It had been fine. I went inside and went to bed and slept without dreaming. In the morning, I noticed the dog. Dalt Renner lived 3 houses down from me on the right side of the street. He was in his 40s, broad through the shoulders, the kind of guy who always seemed to be in the middle of a project. He had a black and brown dog, a shepherd mix, that he walked every morning on a long leash. I'd seen them twice in my first few days here and waved both times. The dog's name was something that started with a B. Birch, maybe, or Burke. That morning, Dalt was at his mailbox and the leash was in his hand, but there was no dog on it. He was looking at the leash like it was a thing he didn't entirely understand. When I walked out to check my own mail, he looked up at me and his eyes were raw, the way eyes get when they've been rubbed too much. I opened my mouth to say something, and then I thought about Rule 9. In the morning, do not discuss what you may have seen or heard during the siren period. I closed my mouth. Dalt nodded once, slowly, and walked back inside without the leash. I stood at my mailbox with a handful of envelopes I didn't read for a long time. I started to notice the houses after that. It's the kind of thing you don't register when you've grown up somewhere because your brain sorts familiar things into background. But I was seeing Calver fresh now, the way you see a place you haven't been in years, and the empty houses jumped out at me. There were 5 of them on my side of town alone. Not run down exactly, not falling apart, but clearly untouched. Grass, not catastrophically overgrown, but not tended either. No curtains in the windows, no cars in the driveways. One of them, a pale yellow 2-story on Gable Street that I'd passed every day on the way to the hardware store, had something strange along the windowsills. A discoloration, dark and uneven, running all the way around every window frame on every floor. I slowed down in front of it the 3rd time I drove past and looked more carefully. Scorch marks. Every window on the house had been scorched, badly, from the outside. Not fire damage in the structural sense, just the frames themselves, the sills, the wooden edges. Whatever had done it had gone to each window specifically. I drove to Cree's hardware store, and I did not ask about it. I was already learning that there were questions you asked in Calver and questions you didn't. My dad's study was the last room I'd gotten to. He'd kept it locked when I was a kid, and it had been mostly closed off in my adult visits too. It was his room in a way the rest of the house wasn't, the place where whatever was private about him lived. And standing in front of it with a key I'd found in his nightstand felt like opening something I hadn't been given permission to open yet. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a man who was organized and quiet and not given to decoration. A desk, a bookshelf, a filing cabinet, his chair, which was the nicest thing in the room, brown leather with a small tear in the left armrest that had been there since I was 12. I went through the desk first. Bills, warranties, insurance documents, the usual. The filing cabinet was his finances, his will, the house paperwork I needed for the estate. all of it clean and sorted, labeled in his neat, blocky print. He'd made dying easy for me in the practical sense, and I found myself genuinely grateful for that, even though it made me sad. The bookshelf was mostly novels, and a few home repair manuals, and a dictionary he'd had since before I was born. On the bottom shelf, wedged between two thicker books, was a small brown notebook with a cracked spine and no label on the cover. I sat in his chair and opened it. It wasn't a diary exactly. He'd never been the diary type. It was more like a place he put things down when he needed to put them somewhere, irregularly and without system. There were dates on some pages, but not all. Years of nothing, and then a few entries clustered together. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Most of it was ordinary. Thoughts about the garden. A note about getting the furnace serviced. A line about calling me that he'd apparently written and then not done. Reading it felt like standing in a room where someone had just left. Near the back, separated from the earlier entries by about 30 blank pages, there were 3 entries written close together. The first one read, "The Miller property has been empty for 6 years now. I walked past it this morning. The windows are still black around the edges. Nobody talks about what happened. I've been here 40 years, and I still can't decide if that's the right way to handle it or not." The second, dated 2 weeks later, first of the month, heard the roof again. I think I've been hearing it every month for years and just filing it away as the house. But this month, I paid attention. It's not the house. It moves in one direction and then back, always from the east side to the front, and then back. It took about 2 hours. I kept the rules. The third, dated about a month after that, was shorter than the others. The ink was pressed harder, like he'd been gripping the pen tighter. I saw it cross the Meller yard. I thought about looking away, and I didn't. I think it knew I could see it. I closed my eyes. It didn't come back to my side of the street. I'll follow the rules better next time. That was the last entry in the notebook. I sat in his chair for a long time after that. I drove past the Meller house on my way home. Yellow 2-story on Gable Street. Scorched frames, dark windows. I parked across the street and looked at it for a while from the car. Whatever had happened there, my dad had seen something and not talked about it because that was Rule 9. He'd seen something cross the yard and he'd closed his eyes and it had gone somewhere else, and he'd kept that to himself for the rest of his life. And the next morning, he'd gotten up and had coffee and probably walked down to get his mail and waved at Dolt and his dog. I thought about Dolt standing at his mailbox with an empty leash. I put the car in drive and went home. I was supposed to have the estate paperwork finalized before the next first of the month. That was the plan. Speak to the lawyer, sign the documents, get the house listed with a realtor, drive back to my apartment in Columbus. Be gone before I had to do this again. The lawyer, a gentle older man named Ferrick, who'd practiced in Calver for 30 years, found a problem with my dad's will. A property boundary dispute with a neighboring lot that had gone unresolved. Something about a survey from the early 90s that didn't match the county records. He was apologetic and thorough, and told me it would take at least 3 more weeks to sort out. Possibly more. I thanked him and went home and sat at the kitchen table with the laminated card in front of me and thought about my options. I could leave anyway, come back when the paperwork was ready. But Ferrick needed me accessible for signatures and questions, and my apartment was 2 hours away, and he'd made it clear this would require several in-person visits. I could stay. I stayed. The week before the second siren night, I started finding it harder to sleep. It wasn't dramatic. No nightmares, no cold sweats. I just lie in bed and find myself listening. The house had a vocabulary of sounds I'd been learning over the past few weeks. The furnace in the basement cycling on and off, the back gate tapping when the wind came from the west, the refrigerator humming in its irregular way. I knew all of these now. I'd catalogued them without meaning to. The sounds I was listening for weren't any of those. On the fourth night of the week, I heard something on the roof at around 2 a.m. Slow and deliberate, east side to front and back, the same as siren night. But it wasn't the first of the month. It wasn't anywhere close. I lay in bed with my eyes open and my hands flat on the mattress, and I breathed through it. It lasted about 20 minutes and then stopped. I didn't hear it again that night. I told myself it was an animal, something with territory issues, something that liked rooftops. The next night, it was there again. Same time, same direction. But this time, when it reached the front of the house, it stopped, and there was a long period of nothing. And then I heard something that I spent the rest of the night talking myself out of. A sound from directly outside the front door. Not knocking. More like the door being slowly tested. The handle not turning, but the door itself in its frame, very gently, finding its limits. Rule 4. If you hear knocking, do not answer. Do not speak. I said nothing. I didn't move. After about 2 minutes, the door went still, and the weight lifted off the roof, and the house went quiet. I sat up the rest of that night in my dad's chair in the study with the light off and the notebook in my lap, not reading it, just holding it, thinking about a man who had lived in this house for 40 years and slept in the bedroom I was sleeping in and listened to the same sounds and kept his mouth shut and followed the rules. The morning after the second test, if that's what it was, I walked across the street and knocked on Petra's door. She opened it before I'd knocked twice, like she'd been expecting me, and she looked at my face and stepped back to let me in without a word. Her kitchen was warmer than mine and smelled like coffee and something baking. She poured me a cup without asking and sat down across from me and folded her hands on the table and waited. I looked out the window last month, I said. She didn't react. I know, she said, or I suspected. There was something in the street. Yes, and something has been on my roof this week, I said. Not on siren night, on regular nights. And last night, it tried the front door. Petra was quiet for a moment. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and looked at the table between us. How much did your father tell you? Nothing. He kept Rule 9 better than anyone, apparently. He did, she said quietly. He really did. She looked up at me. What do you know about where the rules came from? Nothing, I said. I never thought to ask. When I was a kid, it was just the rules. She was quiet for another moment, and I got the sense she was deciding how much to say, or maybe deciding how to say it rather than whether to. The rules were found on the door of the First Baptist Church, she said. Sometime in the late 50s, from what I understand. Nobody knows exactly when because whoever found them didn't make a big event of it. They were nailed to the front door on a card. The preacher at the time, a man named Asil Turo, took them down and brought them to the town council. And the town council looked at them, and the decision was made to follow them. Why? I said. If nobody knew where they came from, why would anyone just start following them? Because, she said carefully, the first of that month had been 3 days before, and 7 families hadn't followed any rules because there weren't any yet. And the next morning, those 7 families were gone. The kitchen was very quiet. Gone, I said. Gone, she said. Just gone. No signs of struggle, no bodies, no evidence of anything. 7 houses empty, people who had been here their whole lives. And the card on the church door had 9 rules that were clearly about something that came on the first of every month. She lifted her coffee cup and put it down without drinking. So the town followed the rules. And the next month, everyone who followed them was still there in the morning. What happened to those 7 houses? Some were taken over by relatives who moved in and followed the rules going forward. Others stayed empty. The ones that stayed empty, she said, the windows are scorched. I thought about the Meller house, the pale yellow paint and the dark frames. The Mellers, I said. She nodded. 1997. Martin Meller decided the rules were superstition. He was a logical man, educated, didn't believe in things he couldn't explain. He refused to follow them. His wife and daughter went to her sister's house on the other side of town that night. Martin stayed. She paused. In the morning, the house was empty and the windows were scorched. I put my hands flat on her kitchen table, the way I'd had them flat on the mattress the night before, grounding myself. What is it? I asked. Nobody knows for certain, she said. Not really. The older people here, the ones who were old enough to remember the first years after the rules came, they called it the attendant. I don't know where that name came from. It might have just started with one person and spread. It's not a name with any history behind it. It's just what people called it. The attendant, I said. It comes every first of the month, she said. It walks through town. If you follow the rules, you're invisible to it. It can't see you or sense you or whatever it does. You're just not there as far as it's concerned. But if you break a rule, even a small one, you become real to it. And once you're real to it, it takes an interest. An interest, I said. Like what kind of interest? It varies, she said. Sometimes it just notices you and then moves on, and that's the end of it. Sometimes, she paused, looking at her hands. Sometimes it comes back, off cycle, between sirens. It comes back to the house of the person who broke a rule, and it tests them. It wants to see if they know the rules well enough to stay invisible even when it's not siren night. If they do, it seems to satisfy something in it. If they don't, she trailed off. What did you mean when you said you knew I'd looked? Because Dalt's dog is gone, she said plainly. Dalt didn't break any rules. He never has. But Lena Parcel, 2 doors down from him, had a window open a crack. Her bedroom, 3rd floor. She thought that small a gap didn't count, I suppose. Or she forgot. The attendant went toward her house. Petra looked at me steadily. But it passed her. It went to Dalt's yard instead. Animals count as residents of a house if they're outside. Rule 5 is very specific. But the attendant chose not to go through Lena's window. Something near her house distracted it first? Something more interesting to it than an open window. Me, I said. You looked directly at it, she said, through a window, which is different from an open window but is still a point of contact. Your eyes found it. That doesn't happen often. Most people who break rules do it accidentally, in small ways, in the dark. They don't actually see anything. You looked and you found it, and it found you back. That's a different category of thing for the attendant. I think it finds it interesting when someone can actually see it clearly. I thought about the shape in the street, the wrong proportions, the way it had turned toward the light in Lena Parcel's window and then not gone there. It came to my house instead, I said. And you held the rules, she said, both nights this week. That's good. That's actually the best possible outcome at this stage. I rubbed my face with both hands. Is there any way to make it lose interest? Any way to go back to being invisible? She was quiet for a long moment. Possibly, she said. If you follow the rules well enough, for long enough, some people believe it accepts you back into the general population eventually. There are people who've had the attendant circle their houses for months and then just one day stopped, like whatever question it was asking had been answered. And if you tried to leave town, I said. The pause before she answered was the most uncomfortable silence I'd sat in since I'd been back in Calver. That's where things get complicated, she said. Petra, it doesn't stay in Calver, she said. It comes here, specifically and consistently, because this is where it has always come. We don't fully understand what Calver is to it, whether the town was built in a place it was already using, or whether there's something about the town specifically that draws it. But when someone who knows about the attendant leaves, it follows them. Not immediately, not always within the first week, but it finds them. I looked at her. There are people who left, she said. Not many. People who decided the rules were too much, or whose circumstances took them away. Mostly, they're just people we don't hear from after a certain point. We don't know the specifics. She said this with a flatness that made it more horrible than if she'd cried. Martin Meller's wife and daughter left Calver the morning after Martin disappeared. They made it as far as her sister's place in Medina. Her sister called the Calver police about 3 weeks later to report them missing. The baking smell in the kitchen had started to feel wrong, like it was coming from somewhere else now. I wasn't planning to stay, I said. I know, she said. My life is in Columbus. My job, my apartment. I know, she said again. There was genuine sadness in her voice. Not guilt, not apology, just sadness. The kind that has been lived with for long enough to become familiar. I sat at her table for a while longer. She refilled my coffee without asking. Outside her kitchen window, the street looked exactly like it always looked. Clean and quiet and ordinary. And the houses lined up in their rows, and the Meller place just out of sight 2 blocks over with its dark, scorched windows, and 900 people going about their Wednesday morning in a town that had been following 9 rules for 65 years. What does it look like? I said finally. When you see it. I haven't seen it, she said. I've followed Rule 3 my entire life without exception. I've heard things. The roof, the way you described it. A sound outside the door once. when I was very young, and I'd accidentally left the porch light on for about 30 seconds after the siren went off. Just my finger on the switch a second too long. I heard something on the porch. I kept Rule 4, and it went away. She looked out the window. The people who've seen it describe it differently. Different sizes, different shapes. But there's always something about it that's almost human. Something about the proportions that's close but not right. Like something wearing the idea of a person rather than actually being one. I thought about the shape in the street, the almost right outline of it, the way my brain had tried to file it as human and kept rejecting the attempt. It's ancient, Petra said. That's the one thing everyone who's looked into it agrees on. Not old the way a person is old, or even old the way a building is old. Old in a way that makes Calver's whole history feel like last Tuesday. Whatever it is, and wherever it comes from, it was here long before we were. We just built a town in its territory without knowing it, and by the time we knew it, we'd been here long enough that the question of leaving had already gotten complicated. I pushed back from the table. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "Your dad knew most of this," she said. "He didn't want to know it, I think. He found his way to it slowly over the years, the same way most people do, through noticing things and asking careful questions and making small connections. He never asked me directly. He came over for coffee plenty of times, but we never talked about it." She picked up my mug and carried it to the sink. "He was a good neighbor, steady. That's what I meant when I said it." I let myself out into the ordinary morning. The weeks between that conversation and the second siren night were the strangest of my life, and also somehow the most routine. I went to Ferrick's office and signed documents. I went through more of the house. I ate dinner. I slept badly, listening for the roof, which came twice more that second week, and then stopped. Whether it stopped because I'd held the rules well enough, or for some other reason I couldn't know. I only knew it was quiet on the third and fourth nights, and then quiet the rest of the week after that. I found myself noticing the quiet, the way you notice an absence you've been dreading the loss of. I had a life in Columbus, a job doing accounts work for a mid-sized company, an apartment with a lease up for renewal in 2 months, friends I saw irregularly, a woman I'd been seeing casually for about 4 months, a Tuesday night basketball game at the community center. All of it sitting there waiting for me 2 hours down the highway. I kept going back to what Petra had said. There are people who left. Mostly, they're just people we don't hear from after a certain point. Martin Meller's wife and daughter had made it to Medina. 3 weeks. I called my mum. She'd left Calver when I was 12, after the divorce, and taken me with her to her sister's place in Cleveland. We'd never talked about the siren nights directly. She'd moved to Arizona 8 years ago, and I talked to her about once a month. "Mum," I said, "do you remember the rules from Calver?" There was a pause on the line, long enough that I thought I'd lost her. "Why?" she said. Her voice had changed slightly, tighter. "I'm back here settling Dad's estate. I've been here about a month. I was just thinking about them." Another pause. "I remember them," she said. "Did you ever think about them after we left?" "No," she said. The speed of it was almost convincing. "Mom, "I don't think about Calva," she said. "I made a specific decision not to. And it's been 20 years and I'm fine. I'm completely fine. Arizona is fine." She paused. "Wrap up your father's estate and come home. Don't stay longer than you have to." She changed the subject to my cousin's new baby, and I let her, and we talked for another 20 minutes, and I hung up and sat on my dad's couch in the quiet house and thought about a woman in Arizona who had made a specific decision not to think about something for 20 years and had been completely fine, or had told herself she was. I got up and made dinner. The second siren night, I was ready. The way you're ready for something you now actually understand. I ate early, cleaned up, moved my phone to the bedroom and set it on the floor in the closet, deep inside, because I wanted no chance of accidentally touching it. I put fresh batteries in all 3 of my dad's flashlights and set them in different rooms so that wherever I ended up, I'd have light if I absolutely needed it, though I didn't plan on using it. At 6, I walked through every room in the house and made a survey of it. Windows locked, back door locked, front door locked, porch light off, every light in the house off before the siren, not after, so there was no risk of a second delay getting to the switch. I sat in the kitchen in the dark at 6:30 and waited. The siren went off at exactly 7. I was already in position, back against the cabinet under the sink, flashlights untouched, phone in the closet, every rule intact from the first second. The first hour passed the way it always passed, dark and quiet and my own breathing. I'd gotten better at managing the silence. I let it be what it was instead of filling it with thinking. At about the hour-and-a-half mark, I heard the roof, east side, the weight of it settling in slowly, deliberate, like it was being placed rather than landing. It moved toward the front of the house in that slow, measured way, and I sat in the kitchen, and I breathed, and I kept my eyes on the dark middle distance, and I did not move toward the window. It reached the front of the house. It stopped. This time it stayed stopped for much longer than before. I counted. I know that sounds strange, just counting silently in my head, but I needed something to do with my mind, and counting gave it somewhere to be. I got to somewhere around 200 before I stopped counting and just sat. The weight on the roof had not moved. It was directly above the kitchen, above me. And then, from the hallway, I heard a chair scrape. My whole body went cold. Not metaphorically, physically cold. A chill that moved from my sternum outward like something had been poured into my chest. There was no chair in the hallway. The hallway didn't have furniture. The scrape had come from the kitchen. Slowly, I turned my head. At the kitchen table, in the chair I'd been sitting in earlier that evening before moving to the floor, there was a figure. The light was bad. The dark was nearly total. But I could see it the way you can see things in deep darkness if you give your eyes enough time, shapes, and outlines finding their definition. A person-shaped thing. Sitting at my dad's kitchen table, hands flat on the surface, back straight in a way that no one who was actually relaxed would sit. I looked at it, and my brain did what it had done when I'd looked out the window last month. It tried to file the shape as human and kept sliding off it. The proportions were close. They were genuinely close. But the angle of the shoulders was wrong, and the neck was slightly too long, and the head sat in a way that suggested a different relationship between skull and spine than any person I'd ever met. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I recognized the shape, not the wrongness of it, not the thing that it was, whatever that was. I recognized the posture, the way it held its head slightly to the left when at rest, the breadth of the shoulders and the specific way they were held, not hunched, not squared, just carried a particular way that I knew. It was wearing my father's body the way Petra had said, like something wearing the idea of a person. Rule 7. If someone in your home begins to act strangely, move to an interior room and close the door. I stood up, slowly, keeping my movement steady, not fast, not panicked. I did not look away from the thing at the table, and I did not let my breathing change, and I moved out of the kitchen and into the hallway, and I went to the bathroom because the bathroom was the only truly interior room in the house. No exterior windows, just the exhaust vent in the ceiling. I closed the door. I sat down on the floor with my back against the bathtub, and I put my hands on my knees, and I breathed. From the kitchen, nothing. No sound of movement, no footsteps, nothing. Then, very softly, the sound of the kitchen chair adjusting, like someone shifting their weight. A long creak and then a settling, then silence. I sat on the bathroom floor with my back against the cold porcelain of the tub, and I counted the tiles on the floor. 42 of them, if you counted the half tiles along the base of the wall. My dad had laid these tiles himself. I knew that because I'd watched him do it when I was 9 years old, mixing the adhesive in a bucket and pressing each tile into place with his big, careful hands, checking the level over and over. The kitchen chair shifted again, once, and then nothing for a very long time. I sat on those tiles, and I breathed and I waited. The second siren came. When it faded, I stayed where I was for a full 2 minutes. Then I opened the bathroom door. The hallway was empty. I walked to the kitchen doorway and looked in. The table was empty. The chair was pushed in slightly, the way it looked when no one had been sitting in it. The house was quiet and still and completely ordinary. I went to the front door and unlocked it and stepped out onto the porch. The street was orange and empty, lights coming on in the houses. Petra's porch light flickered on, and I watched her silhouette move past the window inside. The man in the bathrobe was on his porch again, doing his acknowledgement wave at the street, and I raised my hand back. I went inside. I locked the door. I went to my dad's study and sat in his leather chair and held his notebook, and I stayed there until the sun came up. Petra came over the next morning. She didn't bring food this time. She just came and sat down at my kitchen table, the same chair where the thing had been sitting, and looked at me. "It came inside," I said. She took a breath. "What happened?" I told her. All of it. The shape of it, the recognition, the walk to the bathroom, the floor tiles, the chair shifting. All of it. She listened without interrupting, and when I was done, she was quiet for a long time. "It's testing you," she said, very specifically. The off-cycle visits were the first test. Hold the rules when it's not siren night. You passed that. Last night was the second test. Hold Rule 7 even when what's in your house looks like someone you love. You passed that too, she said. You held it. What's the third test? She looked at the table. "I don't know," she said. "I've never heard of anyone going through this particular sequence. The attendant has been patient with Calva for a long time. It doesn't do this with everyone. Most people live here their whole lives, and the worst they experience is the roof and the waiting. What you described, it coming inside, it wearing a familiar shape, that's not ordinary." "So what does that mean?" "It means it's very interested in you," she said. "Which is either because you have something it wants to understand, or because it's decided to make an example of you. I don't know which." She paused. "But you held the rules, and that's the language it understands. Every time you hold a rule in the face of something it throws at you, you're telling it something. You're telling it you understand the terms." "What are the terms exactly?" She folded her hands. "We stay invisible. We follow the rules. We don't make ourselves real to it. And it passes through us on the first of every month without taking anyone. The rules are the contract. The attendant didn't give us the rules to protect us from the outside world. It gave us the rules to govern the relationship between us. If we hold them, we acknowledge it. We honor whatever this arrangement is. If we break them, we step outside the arrangement and it responds accordingly. It's not protecting us," I said. "The rules." "No," she said. "They never were." I looked at the chair, the ordinary kitchen chair, pushed in at the ordinary kitchen table. "My dad," I said. "His notebook. He saw it cross the Meller yard, and he closed his eyes." Why did closing his eyes help, if he was already visible to it? "Closing your eyes is different from not looking," she said. "Looking and then choosing not to see is an act of deference. It's acknowledging it and then standing down. The attendant seems to understand that. It doesn't want destruction for its own sake. It wants the terms honored." I sat back in my chair. Outside, through the kitchen window, I was now very aware of, the street was going about its morning. A woman walking a small dog, a man reversing out of his driveway. The completely normal theater of a small town's morning routine. "My dad lived here for 40 years alone after my mum left," I said. "He followed the rules and kept his head down and put this notebook in his shelf, and nobody knew what he knew. He just lived here." "He did," Petra said quietly. "Did he talk to you about any of it?" "Not directly," she said. "He asked me once, about 3 years ago, if I thought the rules were meant to protect us or to manage us. I told him I thought they were both, in the same way that any contract manages both parties." She looked up at me. He thought about that for a moment, and then he said, "That's a pretty good deal, all things considered." And then he poured us both more coffee, and we watched the street for a while. And that was the end of it. I thought about my dad sitting on his porch on an ordinary afternoon, watching the street with this specific knowledge behind his eyes, thinking, "That's a pretty good deal, all things considered." And I understood him in that moment better than I had in a lot of years. "He was steady," I said. "He really was," she said. The estate paperwork was resolved on a Thursday morning, 3 days before the third first of the month. Ferrick called me into his office and we went over the final documents, and I signed where he indicated, and he shook my hand and told me everything was in order and I could proceed with listing the house. I sat in the parking lot of his office for a long time. I could leave. The paperwork was done. My obligation here was finished. The house wasn't listed yet, but I could do that remotely. I could drive back to Columbus today, right now, in the next hour. I thought about Martin Meller's wife and daughter making it to Medina before the 3 weeks were up. I thought about my mum in Arizona, completely fine. I thought about the 900 people in Calver who had been born here and lived here and died here, following 9 rules once a month, living their whole lives inside an arrangement they hadn't chosen and couldn't leave and had made their peace with in 1,000 different ways. Cree with his hardware store and his white mustache, Petra with her casseroles and her coffee, Dolt Renner with his empty leash, standing at his mailbox, not talking about it because that was Rule 9. My dad in his chair, reading a novel, being steady. I drove back to the house and I made dinner and I sat in the kitchen and I read for a while. And at 10 o'clock, I went to bed. Outside, the street was quiet and orange and completely ordinary, and I lay there listening to the house's vocabulary of sounds, the furnace, the refrigerator, the back gate, and I waited for the roof, and the roof was quiet. The roof was quiet all week. On the morning of the 1st of the month, I got up and made coffee and sat on the back porch in the early light and looked at the belt of old oaks at the far edge of the yard. They'd been there longer than the house, longer than the street, longer than Calver, longer than Calver had had a name. I went inside and checked the card on the fridge. The ink was still fine. I spent that day getting the house ready the right way. Not efficiently, not quickly, intentionally. I made a real dinner. I cleaned the kitchen properly. I went through every room and made sure every light switch was accessible in the dark, where I'd reach for it without having to think. I set the flashlights where I always set them. I put the phone in the closet. At 6:30, I turned off all the lights and sat in the kitchen in the dark and waited. At 7, the siren went off. I was ready. The first hour passed without incident. The second hour passed. I sat against the cabinet under the sink with my hands on my knees, and I breathed, and I counted the tiles I couldn't see, and I let the dark be what it was. At the 2-hour mark, the roof came. East side. Slow and measured, moving toward the front. I held the rules. It reached the front of the house. It stopped. Right above the kitchen, directly over where I was sitting, the same place as last month. I held the rules. It stayed there, longer than last time, longer than the time before. I counted to 300 without rushing, and it was still there. I counted to 500, still there. Then, from the kitchen table, the sound of the chair, that soft familiar creak of weight settling into it. I did not turn my head. I looked straight ahead at the dark middle distance, and I held Rule 3 and Rule 7 simultaneously. Don't look out the windows. If someone in your home begins to act strangely, move to an interior room. But this time, I didn't move immediately. I sat with it. I let it sit at the table and I sat on the floor, and the two of us were in the kitchen together in the dark, and I kept my eyes forward and I breathed, and I was here and it was here, and I did not run, and I did not speak, and I did not look. After a long time, the chair creaked again. Not the sound of someone shifting, the sound of someone standing up. I moved, steadily, Not fast. Out of the kitchen and to the hallway and to the bathroom, and I sat on the floor with my back against the tub and I counted my dad's tiles. From the kitchen, nothing, no sound, long silence. Then, from directly outside the bathroom door, a sound. Not knocking, breathing, or the suggestion of breathing, the rise and fall of something that was mimicking the sound of a person breathing, very close to the door, a foot away at most, just on the other side of the wood. Rule 4. Do not answer. Do not speak. I held the rules. The breathing stopped. There was a long silence. And then there was nothing at all, and the nothing felt different from the nothing before. Emptier, like a room after someone has left it, rather than a room where someone is hiding. I sat on the bathroom floor until the second siren sounded. When the echo died, I waited 2 full minutes by count, and then I opened the door. The hallway was empty. The kitchen was empty. The house was completely quiet. I walked to the front door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch into the cool October air. The street was waking up its lights, orange and ordinary. Petra's porch lamp coming on. The man in the bathrobe on his porch, right on time, doing his wave at the empty street. I raised my hand. Down the block, I saw a light come on in Dolt Renner's front window. Then another. Then his porch light. His front door opened and he stepped outside with a mug in his hand and stood there, looking at the street the way everyone looked at the street when the second siren had done its work. Checking, making sure. He looked over toward my house and he saw me on my porch and he raised his mug in the same kind of wave I'd exchanged with him at the mailbox. Not hello, acknowledgement. I raised my hand back. The morning after the third siren night, Petra came over early. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and she looked at me for a long time before she asked how it went. I told her, the chair again, moving to the bathroom, the breathing at the door, holding rule 4. She listened. When I was done, she set down her mug and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I think that might be it. What do you mean? The sequence, she said. First it tested you off-cycle on regular nights. Then it came inside and took a familiar shape and tested Rule 7. Then it stood outside a closed door and tested Rule 4. It went through the 3 rules that require the most active choice under the most difficult circumstances, and you held all of them. She looked at me carefully. I think it got the answer it was looking for. Which is what? That you understand the terms, she said. That you're part of the arrangement now. Genuinely part of it. She paused. Not as a newcomer who might bolt. Not as someone following rules they don't believe in because they're scared. But someone who actually holds them. I looked at my coffee. My dad held them for 40 years, I said. He did. And my mom's been in Arizona for 20 years and she's fine. Petra looked at her hands. She left before the attendant had taken any real notice of her specifically. She said carefully, Your father never had a sequence like yours. He saw it once and closed his eyes, and that was the extent of his direct contact. Your mother left before any of that. The people who leave and make it are people the attendant has never identified, never made real. She looked up at me. You're different now. You were made real to it when you looked out that window, and now you've answered it. I think that's a different situation. I thought about this. You think it would let me leave? I think, she said slowly, that the contract is about acknowledgement, honoring the arrangement. If you've done that genuinely, and I believe you have, then you're inside the arrangement in a way that traveling doesn't break. You'd still need to follow the rules on the first of every month, wherever you were. You'd still be part of this. She paused. But I can't promise you anything. Nobody can. The attendant is what it is, and none of us fully understand it. I looked around the kitchen, the laminated card on the fridge, the junk drawer with the flashlights, the tiles on the floor that my dad had laid one by one when I was 9 years old, checking the level with his careful hands. I think I'm going to stay for a while, I said. Petra looked at me. Just for a while, I said, until I know for sure how this works. I'll get the house listed, but I need a few more months. She nodded. It was a nod that held something in it, a careful kind of relief. You'll need a fresh laminated card, she said. The edges on yours are starting to lift. I looked at the fridge, the corn magnet, the card with its rounded edges, the ink still clear and black. I'll get one printed, I said. I called my office and arranged to work remotely. I called my landlord and renewed my lease on a month-to-month basis. I called the woman I'd been seeing, and we had a long, honest conversation that ended better than I'd expected. I arranged for someone to water my plants. I listed my dad's house with a realtor named Soph, who had an office 2 blocks from Cree's hardware store, and who had grown up in Calver and understood, without me having to say anything specific, that I wasn't in any particular rush. I got a fresh card printed at the print shop near the fire station. Heavy cardstock, clean black text, laminated. I put it under the corn magnet on the fridge. On the last day of October, I walked down to the Meller property. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the pale yellow house with the dark, scorched windowsills, and I looked at it for a while. The grass was getting long. The paint on the shutters was flaking at the corners. Inside, through the unadorned windows, darkness and the shapes of rooms that hadn't been used in nearly 30 years. I thought about Martin Meller, who was a logical man and educated, and who didn't believe in things he couldn't explain, and who had spent his last night in this house alone. I didn't know what his last few hours had been like, whether he'd been scared, whether he'd understood too late what the rules actually were. I hoped it had been fast. I don't know why that mattered, but it did. I walked home in the cool evening air, past the neighbors who raised their hands at me from their porches and driveways, past Cree's hardware store, lights on inside, Cree behind the counter doing something with a receipt, past Dolt Renner, who was walking a new dog, a small brown one on a red leash, who pulled toward me and wagged and then looked back at his owner for confirmation. Dolt nodded once. I reached down and let the dog sniff my hand. Good dog, I said. Dolt said nothing, but there was something in his face that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite nothing. Something in between all three that probably had a word somewhere, but that I didn't know. I straightened up and walked the rest of the way home. The 1st of November fell on a Saturday. I was ready well before 7. Dinner done, dishes washed, lights switched off early, phone in the closet, flashlights in their places, fresh batteries, the card on the fridge, white and clean. I sat in the kitchen at 6:30 and felt the town pulling itself inward. The specific and total silence that fell over Calver on these nights. The sound of 900 people choosing not to exist for a few hours was the most convincing thing I could have shown someone from outside this place to make them understand. You can't fake that sound. 900 people choosing collectively to be invisible. It takes a specific kind of understanding to be that quiet. The siren went off at 7. I was already on the floor with my back against the cabinet under the sink, hands on my knees, eyes at the middle distance. The town exhaled and went still. I breathed. I counted the tiles. I held the rules. Around the 90-minute mark, the weight settled onto the roof, east side, slow and deliberate, moving toward the front. I breathed. It reached the front of the house and stopped directly above the kitchen. Same place, same weight. Patient and enormous and old in a way that made my entire life feel very brief. I held the rules. The weight stayed, longer than any time before. I counted past 600 before I stopped counting and just breathed and waited. The chair in the kitchen did not creak. Nothing in the house moved. The hallway stayed empty. No sound came from anywhere inside. The weight on the roof shifted, not moving away, more like adjusting, settling in, like something getting comfortable. I sat on my dad's tile floor in the dark of his kitchen, and I let it sit on the roof above me, and I breathed, and I was still, and I was quiet, and I understood, in the way you understand things that can't quite be put into words, that the arrangement had been acknowledged. We were in it together, the town and the thing on the roof, and the roof would stay quiet in the months when I was careful, and the months when I wasn't would be something I'd face when they came, and the laminated card on the fridge would be the same card my dad had read every month for 40 years before I was old enough to read it myself, and the corn magnet would hold it in place, and the tile floor would be there when I needed something solid. My dad's voice came to me very clearly in the quiet. Not supernatural, not a presence, just memory, the way grief delivers things sometimes. 3 words he'd said to Petra over coffee when she'd explained the nature of the contract. That's a pretty good deal. I held the rules, and I waited for the second siren. The weight on the roof stayed where it was above me, patient and old and present, and the town lay silent all around us in the dark, and I breathed, and time passed the way time passes on these nights. Not quickly and not slowly, but with a weight of its own. The second siren came. It climbed for 3 seconds and leveled out and held for 15, and then faded into the ordinary quiet of a November night. Outside, Calver began the slow process of becoming itself again. Porch lights, car doors, the soft return of voices. I waited the full 2 minutes. Then I got up off my dad's floor, unlocked the front door, and stepped out into the ordinary night. The street was orange and still and exactly as it had always been. And I stood on the porch in the cool November air and raised my hand to the man in the bathrobe, and he raised his back, and we stood on our separate porches in the dark for a little while, not speaking, which was fine. There was nothing to say. There never was after.